Hi guys, welcome to the first of 3 videos that will be based on A Christmas Carol. So as requested, I am going to do a session on themes. That's my lesson 1. Then we're going to look at characters in lesson 2. And then the third lesson that I'm going to put together for you is an exam question. So using everything that we've learned, how do we bring all of that together to make sure that we actually do well in our exams? So that is the plan. Let's just go straight in. So as I've just mentioned, we have got themes, characters, exam question. So today we're going to have a look at the main themes. There are many, but these are the key ones that I think will help you with any essay you may get given. Okay, so let's have a look. We want to be thinking here about a theme which is something that runs throughout the story, and that's really important. And Christmas and tradition is going to be the first one that we look at. So Christmas, really, really important. The idea of tradition, really, really important, especially during the Victorian era, because family and traditions were really, really important values. And that's essentially what Dickens is trying to do. So the first point I've got there is that the morals of this story of A Christmas Carol are based around the traditional Christian values, and they were really popular at the time. People were very religious, so they believed in this idea of being charitable, valuing your family and friends, being kind. And essentially that's what happens in this story. Scrooge is taken on a journey by the ghosts to learn about the Christian ideals, or perhaps to be reminded of the Christian ideals. And there's that hidden message there from Dickens. And remember, if you've watched my other lessons, the idea of your 7 pluses is thinking about the writer's purpose. Why would Dickens be doing this in the first place? And so here, he's not just reminding Dickens of the Christian ideals, but he's reminding the whole society that is in a bit of trouble of those Christian ideals, and that we should be charitable, we should value our family and friends far more than perhaps we are. Okay. Really important that you can make a note if you have an exam question on tradition or values or Christmas time. This is written in staves. It's not written in chapters. So staves come from songs and carols, and that links quite nicely in with Christmas, the idea of singing Christmas carols. So he's deliberately tied that theme of Christmas and tradition even into the chapters by calling them staves. Now, that's a very simple point to make, a very brief point to make, but an important point to just note down. Okay. Now, if we continue that further, think, okay, how do we now maybe push this a bit more for those higher grades? We want to think about how this idea of singing, and we can relate to this as modern readers, it lightens the atmosphere. So when we sing songs, we feel happy, or they help us feel that emotion. And Christmas carols purposefully are to lighten the mood. And this is important because that means it's a juxtaposition against this serious, somber kind of tone that's running throughout that story. Juxtaposition is just this contrast. So we've got this idea of Christmas and charity and songs and joy, and then we've got Scrooge and actual poverty and despair. So there's a nice kind of just to juxtapose those two ideas to make one stand out in a little more detail. The next thing that we could talk about for Christmas and tradition is Fred, who essentially is the embodiment of the Christmas spirit. So no matter what happens, he is jolly, he is forgiving, he's definitely forgiving of Scrooge, and he's charitable even though he has nothing. And that's a really, really important kind of point. And Dickens was trying to do here is to bring in this idea that yes, we have a class system, but it doesn't mean perhaps that the lower classes are lazy, and that actually this Victorian upper class really felt that the lower classes were poor, they couldn't be bothered to work, they weren't willing to help themselves, so why is it my job to help them? If you can think about a quote where Scrooge says, reduce the surplus population, like I'm not giving them to money, like they're not my problem. And actually, what's happening here is Dickens trying to challenge those misconceptions. And he does that through Fred, through the Cratchit family, where actually these poor families are represented as the opposite to Scrooge. Scrooge is the one that should be forgiving and charitable and jolly, and he isn't. The people in the Victorian era felt that the lower classes were lazy and unwilling. And then Fred completely spins that on its head and shows us that actually what you're thinking about us is not the truth. We are grateful and we give and we will do anything that we can. And that kind of then ties in with this idea of the Christmas spirit. And then we have essentially the idea of him making it at Christmas time, setting this at Christmas. And that's important because we've then got this cold, cold, harsh weather. It's much easier to make life for the poor, that poverty, really stand out in the winter when it's dark, it's miserable, it's cold. This idea of Scrooge not wanting to throw any coal on the fire, and we need that fire to keep us warm. So the harshness of the winter and Christmas time, which should be a happy time, kind of it contrasts quite nicely and helps reflect and highlight the impact that it has on the poor families. So that is the first idea, the first theme of Christmas, of tradition, tying it in with the values. There's a couple of quotes down the side that you might want to be able to kind of use and tie in, and I've mentioned some as well. So let's move on now to family, which is another really important theme. Family or lack of family in certain cases. So we're going to start with Scrooge, who he is an isolated character. He's described as solitary as an oyster, and I've already done a video analysing that language in a bit more detail. But he deliberately detaches himself. He chooses to push everyone away from him. We learn through the journey with the ghost that it's because of him, his heartbreak when he was younger, but he just keeps everybody away. So he's really, really isolated. He isn't a family orientated man. And that again is important because he refuses to add that coal to the fire. He is this cold, harsh, miserable character. And then Fred walks in and suddenly the room is warm and glowing. And that's a really nice way again to contrast these two characters. Scrooge should be the one providing the warmth and isn't. So we can see Scrooge here again, that idea of juxtaposition. He's juxtaposed with the Cratchit family because despite the fact that they have nothing, they're happy. Scrooge has everything and he's miserable. So money doesn't buy happiness. And we've got this idea that actually family is far more important than anything else. And if you have your family and you have your health, then that's all that matters. And this idea that the lower classes value family, we go back to that idea of those Christian morals and this idea that actually family life is idealized. It's really, really important, or it's seen to be important. The families during the Victorian era were really large, lots and lots of children, 6, 7, 8 children, but the death rate was really high. So quite often children would die before the age of 5 or 6. And that sense of loss made the poorer families realize actually how important that was, and that actually it doesn't really matter that we don't have any money and we have nothing because we have each other. And that's quite a nice simple theme to talk about for family, but a really effective one where you can add a couple of points there for each of those. And then probably the biggest issue facing Victorian society, and probably the most important reason behind him writing this novel. Poverty was huge, and humbug is symbolic of that upper class, the idea that they're really insensitive, they're really naive. Oh, it's not my problem, it's nothing to do with me. Well, actually, it kind of is. And there's a lot here that can help get you those higher grades, because this is all about writer's purpose, remember. So what Dickens trying to do with this theme. And we have to think about context here, that we had the Industrial Revolution, which had a huge impact on society. Lots of people were moving in from the countryside to try and get work. So the working conditions were really, really poor. The factories were massively overcrowded. They weren't really getting paid anything. And it was terrible. And Dickens just couldn't sit and watch this happen. So he was trying to give a message to the Victorian society that they needed to change. And the easiest way to do that is to use the characters of Scrooge and the Cratchit family. And Scrooge, who shows that our consequence, like we have actions have consequences, and they're actually larger than you think, which is true in today's society. And you don't really think about actually what consequences me doing this going to have on that person, but it will have a consequence, an impact on them. And Dickens is trying to get us to think about that in a little bit more detail. So what happens here is when Scrooge goes from being this miserly, old, cold character and he transforms, he changes. What Dickens is showing here is that that transformation actually doesn't just benefit Scrooge, but it benefits Bob, it benefits Tiny Tim, it benefits the Cratchit family. In fact, it probably benefits everybody in this novel, because everyone hated Scrooge and now he's like this jolly, jolly guy. So by having that contrast in his character and him changing throughout the story helps to highlight that poverty and how the upper classes really could make a difference. So we've got, oh, I've already mentioned that one, apologies. Let's move on to time. So last theme from me. We're going to just have a look. Time is a bit complicated to sort of get your head around, so try not to overthink it. Time, it just is an essence really of Dickens trying to show that time is really important and time is precious, and that anything that you do can impact your future. Think about your past, think about your actions, live in the present, and think about those consequences of your future. So time, or the idea of passing time, is throughout this whole novel. So we have to remember the ghosts appear to Scrooge, and they even themselves, the ghost of the Christmas past, present and future. The actual ghost represents 3 different stages of time. And that's a nice kind of paragraph that you could write about in an essay on the idea of time and that kind of importance of time and how each of those links to each other and helps give him a message. Now, remember as well that they come in chronological order. So it's not that we get really confused. He wants to keep it simple. So that chronological order illustrates really the connection between your past, your present, your future, and that you can do something about it. And you have the time to change. Then we have another point here about Marley's ghost, who essentially comes to represent how little time Scrooge has left, and the fact that when you are dead, time means nothing. There's kind of no point. So make the most of it whilst you can. And Marley is quite, because he's coming from death to warn him, he's a really important character there to mention in terms of that importance of time. And probably the most interesting one that you could talk about is the idea that time is a threatening force. So it tends to just continue relentlessly, and Scrooge kind of wants things to slow down and he wants things to stop, but it just keeps going. That clock, the heavy bell, the time's ringing is all the way through. If you go back and look at the story, time and the sound of time, the sound of the clock, is there all the time, and it's kind of just threatening him and reminding him that he hasn't got long, it is important, it's not going to wait for him, he's not ready to meet the next ghost, he doesn't have a choice, and it's kind of pressuring him and pushing him and pushing him and pushing him to make those changes. And that links quite nicely back to this idea of, funny there, for 3 stages of the past, the present and the future. And again, I've got some quotes down the side there. That might seem like a very, very quick overview, but they're the key themes in a nutshell, with a couple of quotes, which you could watch again and make a few notes as you're going through. Essentially, if you get a question on one of those themes, every bullet point that I've had there is a whole paragraph in itself. That's your whole essay planned for you if you wanted it to be like that. So I really hope that you found that helpful, and please keep an eye out. I will try and put video 2 up as soon as possible, and then you'll be able to have a look at all 3 lessons and Christmas Carol done. Any questions? Give me a shout. Please remember to share, tell people. I'll help in any way I can. Hopefully see you next time. Take care, guys.